In a small town in Pennsylvania, two neighbors and friends, Lucas and Mateus, shared a love for adventure and exploration. They lived on properties surrounded by vast forested areas that stretched up to the nearby hills. One evening, while Mateus was at Lucas's house, he mentioned something strange he had found in the forest behind his home, an old tunnel supported by wooden beams. Lucas's curiosity was immediately piqued. He grabbed his backpack, stocked with a flashlight and a water bottle, and the two headed to Mateus's house. They walked for about 20 minutes through the forest until they reached the tunnel described by Mateus. It was a simple corridor, with wooden pillars supporting the entrance and nothing else around. Mateus, using Lucas's flashlight, illuminated the inside of the tunnel. It seemed to be an abandoned mine, but surprisingly empty, with no signs of the equipment or rails common in old mines. They entered, following the path that extended into the darkness. The cold and eerie atmosphere of the tunnel made every step echo. After a few minutes, they reached the end of the main corridor and found another path to the left, with an arrow on the wall pointing towards the exit. What caught their attention was the amount of trash around: garbage bags, food wrappers, and water bottles, all surprisingly clean, as if they had been left there recently. Lucas felt a growing unease, but Mateus suggested that it might just be teenagers using the place. They continued, but Lucas couldn't help looking back, making sure no one was following them. Suddenly, Mateus stopped. Lucas, catching up to him, saw that he was staring at another corridor, frozen. "We need to go," Mateus whispered, urging Lucas to turn back. On the way back, a loud bang echoed through the tunnel, quickening their steps until they emerged into the daylight. Back at Mateus's house, Lucas asked what had happened. Mateus, visibly shaken, revealed that he had seen a naked man holding a squirrel or rabbit, as if he were about to skin it. Lucas wanted to believe it was a prank, but Mateus's expression was one of pure disturbance. They never went back to the tunnel. In the following days, Mateus returned to his normal self, but the experience remained etched in his memory. Lucas never saw the man Mateus described, but his friend's reaction was convincing enough. The incident left an unforgettable lesson about the hidden dangers in those forests and the possibility of encountering people living on the fringes of society, in places where no one would expect. Once upon a time, in a small town surrounded by woods and fields, there was a group of teenagers, including myself, seeking adventure away from the watchful eyes of adults. We had been friends since childhood, growing up together on quiet streets and shaded parks. But as we grew older, our interests changed. At 14 years old, we began to explore more, venturing beyond the familiar boundaries of our neighborhoods. Our escapades usually began with meetings at diners or parks, where we shared laughter and planned adventures. Our group consisted of me, Lucas, the thinker, Raphael, the fearless one, and Marina, the bravest of us all. Our parents, worried about the usual teenage shenanigans, often questioned our outings, but we always had a ready excuse. During winter break, we faced a problem: many of our favorite hangout spots closed early, and the cold nights forced us to seek shelter. That's when Raphael suggested exploring an old farm, a family heirloom, abandoned for years. He described it as a place forgotten by time, where we could have privacy and adventure. With the idea approved by the group, we set out on a chilly Saturday night. Raphael drove his old car down the dirt road, illuminated only by the headlights. The winding path led us to a wooden fence, closed with a chain. We parked and climbed over the fence, excitement overcoming any hesitation. The farm was shrouded in darkness. We couldn't see the house in the distance, only the silhouette of trees against the night sky. Raphael led us down a gravel path, recounting stories about the place. The farm had belonged to his grandparents, but after their passing, the property had been left to the mercy of time. After 10 minutes of walking, the house finally appeared before us. Its appearance was desolate: the roof sagged in some spots, windows were broken, and the paint was peeling. We entered through the back door, which was open. Our cell phones illuminated the dusty interior. The house seemed untouched, as if time had stopped there. We split up to explore. I walked down a dark hallway and saw a shadow quickly pass at the end of it. My heart raced, and for a moment, I was paralyzed. I called out to my friends, but I knew it wasn't any of them. The figure was tall and slender, unlike any of us. I regrouped with Lucas and Marina, and together we spotted the mysterious figure. It stood there, watching us. For a moment, no one moved, until Marina whispered that we should leave. We started running towards the exit, fear propelling us. We didn't know if the figure was following us, but we didn't look back. We reached the car, panting and scared, and Raphael sped back to town. We discussed who the figure might be, a drifter, a former resident, or something more sinister. In a small town in the countryside, a group of friends and I were looking for ways to entertain ourselves. We lived in an area where entertainment options were limited, so we often turned to abandoned places as our secret meeting spots. There was an old theater in town that had been closed for years. The doors were locked, and the windows were covered, but the place still held a mysterious charm. Rumors about its history and the reasons for its closure always intrigued us. We decided that exploring the theater would be our next adventure. One Saturday night, equipped with flashlights and backpacks, we sneaked over to the theater. We managed to enter through a broken side door. The interior was vast and covered in dust, with old torn velvet seats and a stage that had seen better days. As we explored the lobby and dressing rooms, we discussed the performances that might have taken place there. Suddenly, we heard a sound coming from the stage. It sounded like the noise of something being dragged. We thought it might be other explorers like us, or perhaps an animal. We decided to investigate. Walking cautiously towards the stage, we realized that the sound was coming from below, possibly from the basement where old costumes and props were stored. The basement door was slightly ajar, and curiosity overcame our fear. We descended the stairs slowly, and with each step, the sound grew louder. When we reached the bottom, we saw a figure leaning against one of the costume racks. We stood still, trying to discern who or what it was. The figure turned around, and we realized it was an older man, wearing worn-out clothes and a confused look. He began to speak in a low, trembling voice, about how he used to be an actor at the theater and how he had returned to relive his glory days. His words were disjointed, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes. We didn't know how to react, but we felt that we should leave him alone. Silently, we returned to the lobby and exited the theater. The experience left us with a strange feeling, a mixture of fear, compassion, and curiosity. Growing up, my neighborhood wasn't the most pleasant place to live. People settled there because they couldn't afford a better place, not because they wanted to. The houses were small and old, and businesses struggled to stay open for more than a year or two. It was a place filled with abandoned buildings and a sense of desolation. Despite its gloomy reputation, it was also a place where childhood curiosity led us to explore the eerie remnants of a long-forgotten town. One Saturday night, my friend Ryan and I decided to enter an abandoned elementary school that had been left to rot for years. The school had always been a bit eerie, even when it was still in operation. Located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods and encased in barbed wire fencing, it seemed out of place for an elementary school. To get to the school, we had to walk about 4 miles from Ryan's house, as neither of us had a car. The building had a haunting aura that was hard to ignore. As we approached, the barbed wire fence seemed almost like an inadequate barrier to the darkness inside. We climbed over the fence and approached the side of the building, looking for a way in. Fortunately for us, most of the windows were already broken, providing an easy point of entry. I went in first through the shattered glass, followed by Ryan. Our first moments inside the school were spent in silence, listening for any signs of other explorers or inhabitants. The building emitted a constant, eerie creaking noise, like hollow groans, but it seemed like we were alone. We walked cautiously down the dimly lit hallway, peering into various classrooms. Seeing the school in such a degraded state was a surreal experience. Empty rooms or ones filled only with rows of chairs greeted us until we reached a deeper corridor inside the school. This corridor was blocked by scattered chairs, forcing us to push them aside to access the rooms. The first room was locked, so we moved to the second on the left. What we found was a disturbing sight, clothes hanging from the ceiling, swaying gently in the still air. Puzzled by this strangeness, I entered the room, only to realize that Ryan hadn't said a word since we entered. As I turned to look at him, my eyes suddenly caught a glimpse of something chilling in the back of the room. I froze as my gaze locked onto a disheveled man standing there, holding something in his hand. What made the situation even more unsettling was the fact that he was almost naked. Panic overtook me as I quickly turned to Ryan, who was also staring at the man. Before we could react, the man drew our attention, pointing at us with whatever he held in his hand. Fear engulfed us when we realized it was a knife. In that moment, the world around us seemed blurry, and instinct took over. Ryan grabbed my arm, pulling me out of the room and into the corridor. As we ran down the hallway, we heard the sound of metal hitting the floor, followed by a chilling scream. Adrenaline coursed through our veins as we sprinted towards the nearest open window and leaped out of it. We ran as fast as our legs could carry us, gasping for breath, putting as much distance as possible between us and that terrifying encounter. It was only after catching our breath during the remainder of the walk back home that we were able to piece together the fragments of the horrors of that night. The man in the abandoned school was clearly disturbed, and his actions suggested that he could pose a serious threat to our lives. If we had stayed longer or hadn't noticed him in time, the outcome could have been tragically different. In the American Midwest, where my friends and I grew up, leisure options were scarce. We used to gather in parks, have a drink, and chat to pass the time. One year, a nearby public swimming pool closed down, leaving behind only a large empty hole where there used to be water. As months passed with no signs of activity at the site, we decided that it would be our new hangout spot. One Friday night, we jumped the fence of the abandoned pool, brought drinks in plastic cups, and sat in the old empty pool. We were chatting about random topics when we heard the sound of the gate moving. Immediately, we thought it might be the police, and we grew tense, as none of us were of legal drinking age. As we braced for the worst, we heard footsteps on the pavement and the sound of a bathroom door opening and closing. All of us were wondering who could be there at that hour. We concluded that it would be best to leave before the person decided to come out of the bathroom. We quietly sneaked out of the pool and jumped the fence, starting to make our way back home. However, one of my friends realized he had left his phone there. Reluctantly, he and I decided to go back and retrieve it while the others continued on their way. Arriving there, we tried to be as quiet as possible. While my friend went down to get his phone, I stood watch. Everything seemed quiet until he started coming up the stairs, and I saw a figure moving near the kiddie pool. My heart raced as the figure, who had been crouched down, stood up and began running toward us. I helped my friend up the stairs, and we ran as fast as we could, driven by adrenaline. I heard the sound of a bottle shattering and shouts behind us. The man was yelling for us to stay away from him. Struggling, we climbed the fence and tumbled on the other side. As I got up, I saw the man, an older, barefoot man in torn jeans and a stained yellow shirt. His face was grizzled, and his appearance was disheveled. Without wasting any time, I continued running. The man continued yelling for us to never come back. At the time, it was terrifying, but now, older, we laugh about the situation. We believed the man might have been a homeless person and perhaps wasn't in full control of his mental faculties, imagining that we had ill intentions. After that experience, we never returned to that abandoned pool. In a small town surrounded by mountains and dense forests, lived a solitary adventurer named Carlos. It had been years since he had ventured on a camping trip, but a growing need to reconnect with nature led him to plan a 4-day camping excursion. Carlos chose an obscure mountain, about a 2-hour drive from his home. He didn't pay much attention to trail selection. His goal was to relax next to his tent, away from the day-to-day stress. With supplies for 4 days, he found a spot to park his car on a dirt patch next to the road and began his journey. After nearly 2 hours of hiking, Carlos reached a point where the trail split into 3. Without hesitation, he chose the left path and, after 30 minutes, reached the camping area. The place was deserted, covered in vegetation, a sign that few people visited. Carlos set up his tent, had lunch, and spent time writing in his journal, soaking in the tranquility of the forest. As the sun began to set, he started gathering firewood. That's when he discovered something unusual, a narrow path, clearly formed by human footsteps, leading into the woods. Curious but also uneasy, Carlos decided to investigate before spending the night there. Following the path, Carlos noticed it was well marked, indicating that someone used it frequently. After 15 minutes of walking, he stumbled upon an old, run-down cabin. The door was open, and the dark interior seemed to contain various objects. As Carlos was about to enter, a raspy voice echoed behind him, "Go away, leave this place." Startled, he turned to find a seemingly ordinary man, dressed in clean clothes, standing a few meters away. Without saying a word, Carlos obeyed and walked away, but not before casting one last glance back. The man remained motionless, watching him until he disappeared from view. Back at the campsite and with night falling, Carlos decided it wasn't safe to stay. He quickly packed up his tent and embarked on a risky hike back to his car, guided only by the light of his flashlight. During the journey back, Carlos reflected on the encounter. Who was that man? Why was he there? And most intriguingly, if he didn't live in the cabin, who had created and maintained the path? These questions remained unanswered, fueling Carlos's imagination about the hidden mysteries in the depths of that forgotten forest. Newly arrived in a new town, John sought a radical change in his life. Tired of the urban hustle and bustle, he decided to rent a secluded house in a quiet area, surrounded by dense forest. The property, according to the kind owner, seemed perfect, modern, spacious, and with a vast plot of land, ensuring privacy and isolation. During the first week, John barely had time to explore the surroundings due to work. But on a Friday afternoon, he arrived home early and decided to take a walk through the forest next to the residence. While walking, something strange caught his attention, a distant structure partially hidden by trees. It appeared to be an old building, but not an inhabited house. Night was approaching, and John decided to head back, but curiosity about the strange construction made him contact the owner. With no response, he tried to put the matter out of his mind and went to sleep. The next day, still with no word from the owner, John decided to investigate on his own. Getting closer, he confirmed that it was an abandoned house, small and apparently 2 stories tall. Walking around the building, he felt uneasy about the proximity of the dilapidated house and the fact that no one had informed him of its existence. The back door was ajar, hanging on its hinges. Driven by the need to know what was inside, John entered. The smell was terrible, and he expected to find a dead animal, but there was only an old table in the center of the main room. The windows were boarded up, and a staircase led upstairs, which was in complete darkness. John illuminated the stairs with his cell phone, but, to his surprise, there was no second floor, only a wooden wall at the top of the stairs. Confused, he heard faint breathing on the other side of the wall and footsteps upstairs. Terrified, he ran back to his own house, locking himself in and watching for anyone following him. Unsure if the abandoned house was on his property and still with no response from the owner, John decided to call the police. But when officers investigated, they found no one, and they said the second floor was accessible, contradicting what John had seen. In the following weeks, the owner's silence continued, until John decided to terminate the lease and move out, leaving behind the house and its mysteries. While he had not been directly threatened, this experience remained one of the most frightening and unusual of his life. And thus, we conclude our journey today. Every abandoned place tells a unique story and hides secrets that challenge our courage. If you enjoyed this chilling journey, don't forget to leave a like and share the video with your friends. And of course, if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now and hit the bell icon to not miss any of our future videos. And remember, it will always be a pleasure to be here with you.